Thank you, Nick, for that great song leading. Chaz for the prayer, Brady for the Bible reading. And we do pray this morning that it is well with your soul. Let's not any of us take for granted the blessings that we have. Let's be aware of them. Let's understand them. And let's understand what Jesus did for us and what he's given to us. We have a great spiritual family here. Hope you've been edified this morning. I know I have already. And I know I'm going to do my best to try to edify you even more. Let me ask you a question. Who is your hero? Who is your hero? Do you have a hero? You ever thought about it? Think about it for just a second. Who's your hero? You know, I think for the most part, for too long a time, really, when we mention hero or we think about heroes, we might think of it in terms of, well, who can hit that baseball the furthest? Who can jump the highest? Who can score so many points in a particular professional basketball game? Who can get so many rebounds? It might be that person listed among the Forbes richest 400 in the world. You know, I don't know. Maybe your hero might be a movie star, celebrity. What about maybe somebody at work that you work for, your boss? Who is your hero? Is it that rapper? Is it that gamer? Who might it be? Your favorite YouTube sensation? Do you fill your mind with thinking about emulating yourself to rise to the status of where you have put this hero? You ever think about that? And then when suddenly that hero might let you down, what happens? You go into a depression, mood swings, impossible relationships, trouble at school. We adults might go through stages of unhappiness, divorce, spousal abuse, simply because someone has let us down or our hero didn't turn out to be who we thought he was or she was. Maybe we've been looking in the wrong places. You know, human nature will cause us to look up to somebody. Somebody's going to grab our attention and say, hey, I want to be just like that person. Well, who might it be? I remember being asked years ago who was my hero, and looking back on it now, I am so ashamed, so ashamed. You know who my hero was at the time when I was asked that? Now, I was a lot younger, lot younger. Mickey Mantle. Now, some of you out there don't know who Mickey Mantle was, but during my childhood, during my 10 to 20-year-old period, Mickey Mantle was one of the best baseball players that's ever played. Who was my hero? Mickey Mantle's my hero. Little did know, man, I didn't know anything about the world. I didn't know anything about people, and I sure didn't know anything about Mickey Mantle. Because later in life, I'd find out Mickey Mantle, oh man, you're talking about an athlete on steroids at the time, an athlete taking drugs, an athlete who had marital problems, an athlete who was a womanizer, an athlete who had all of these problems. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mantle. Boy, that's embarrassing now. That's embarrassing. As I started studying the Bible more, giving attention to really the important things, Hebrews 11, it's been called the a Bible Hall of Fame, so to speak. And Hebrews 11, 1 through 34, there's a listing of what we'll call some big names, okay? God's heroes, so to speak. And I'm just going to call off, a few of them there. There in verse 4, Abel. Then it talks about Enoch, and then Noah, and Abraham, and Sarah. And, it goes all the way through 31, Jacob there in 21, Joseph in 22, Moses in 23. And then over in 35 to 40, we might call the listing there no names. The first half of chapter 11 there would be the big names. The last half would be the no names. It talks about people who were being tortured there in 35, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisoned. They were stoned, sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. These are the heroes of God. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mantle. Do we think on that type level? When we think about our heroes, do we think on that type level? Don't be embarrassed like I was. Let's lift our sights to allow our heroes to be God's heroes. To be God's heroes. And these heroes, whether in the Old Testament, whether in the New Testament, they lived by certain principles. Colossians 3:2 was one of the principles that they lived by. Colossians 3:2, set your mind on the things above, not on the things of the earth. All of God's heroes had to have this in their mind, whether they were in the Old Testament or New Testament. Matthew 6:33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. See, this is how the heroes think. And then Matthew 22:36. Teacher, what is the great command? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. You see, this is what makes heroes. And these verses contain principles for that. And they can be summed up in the description of a couple of people, all right? In James 2:22, we're told that Abraham was called a friend of God. A friend of God. In Acts 13:22, we were told that David was called a man after God's own heart. And then the third one that I want to mention, and this is the one where we'll spend our time, is a guy named Caleb. Caleb. Now you remember Caleb in the Old Testament. He was one of the spies there with Joshua. And Caleb is usually in Joshua's shadow. You don't hear a whole lot about Caleb. But the description term there for Caleb is a man who followed God fully. A man who followed God fully. Let's look in Numbers 32:11. Numbers 32:11 and 12. Surely none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and above shall see the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me. Now remember that. They have not wholly followed me. It doesn't say they hadn't followed me a little bit. It didn't say that they hadn't followed me some. It said they have not wholly followed me, or followed me all the way, so to speak. Now let's look at verse 12. Except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed me. They have wholly followed me. Now, like I said, we hear about Joshua a lot. We don't hear about Caleb a lot. But Caleb wholly followed the Lord. Over in Deuteronomy 1:36, it talks about that. Also listed 4 other places in Joshua 14:8, 9, and Joshua 14:14. Confirms that Caleb wholly followed the Lord. You talking about a hero? Talking about a hero? And this hero is kind of hidden, all right? We don't hear a whole lot about Caleb. We don't. Well, this morning I want you to try to learn something about this man. Because these are the type of people that should be our heroes. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mantle. Please, Mickey Mantle. Remember what God had promised. Back in Deuteronomy 6, God said, I'm going to give you a land. And I'm going to give you a land that is bursting with fruit, bursting with food, cities that's been built, houses that's full of good things. I'm going to give you vineyards that's already growing. I'm going to give you all of this good stuff. And then in Joshua 24, starting in verse 12, he reiterates what has been given to them. Again, all of these cities that's already built, that you didn't have to build, cisterns and wells that you didn't have to dig, trees that you didn't have to plant. And I'm going to send the hornet before you in battle. But there was something that happened between the promise and between its fulfillment. In Deuteronomy 1:20, God told the people to go in and take the land. Go in and take the land. Go up right now and take the land. But the people said, let's see what we need to do. You know what? It might be good if we send some people over there to check this place out. God said, go in and take the land. But the people hesitated. They hesitated. And Moses allowed them to send some spies out. Spies out. And that's in Numbers 13 that we'll get to in just a second. Those spies went out, 12 of them. 10 of them brought back in a negative report, so to speak. One report. 2 brought back in a positive report. But both of those reports were true. Were true, depending on who brought them back. The 10 who brought back that report said, man, you know, we can't do this. They trusted in themselves. They didn't trust in God. They didn't trust in God. They believed that they must deliver themselves. They didn't believe that God was going to help them. And they not only did that, but they convinced others that, hey, we can't do this. We can't do this. So as far as they're concerned, that was truthful from their standpoint. And Joshua and Caleb, of course, the other 2 brought back this report that said, hey, man, let's go up. Let's take this land right now. They trusted in God. They knew that they could prevail because they had God's help. They saw God as a deliverer, so to speak. And they rejoiced with what God was giving them. 10 men saw giants. 2 men saw God. 10 men thought of themselves as grasshoppers. 2 of the men thought of themselves as hornets. As hornets. This morning, let's consider Caleb. Brady read Numbers 14:24 for us. And that's going to be the thrust of our lesson this morning. But my servant, Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Caleb is a servant. He has a different spirit, and he has surrendered his life, so to speak, to God in his obedience, in what he believed, and in his service. That's the type hero Caleb was. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse. I suggest to you this morning, okay, for us, that we need to be a friend of God, a man after God's own heart. We need to be a man who follows God fully. Fully. We must be a servant. We must have a different spirit. And we must surrender our lives to God. That's what Caleb did. And that's why Caleb is a hero. Let's set our mind on things above, not on the things that are on earth. And that's what I was doing for a lot of my life. I was setting my sights, my goals, my thinking, the mental exercises. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mantle. Beautiful. Beautiful. As a servant, okay, think about this. As a servant, Caleb, he was known, obviously known, because he was picked as the one man out of the tribe of Judah. And there's some discussion as to whether he was a full-blown a Jewish person, etc., whether his father was a Kenizzite, etc. I've studied all of that. Took a lot of time this week working that out. There's pros and cons both ways. Obviously, though, if he wasn't, he certainly was accepted as a Jew and started serving in that capacity. All right. Personally, I think he was. He's born into the house of Judah in slavery, and that's where he came out of, so to speak. But anyway, he was well known within the tribe of Judah because he was selected as a leader there. He was evidently well liked because he was selected as a leader. He was probably an example to the others. You don't get selected one out of 35, 40,000 men and not have certain characteristics, positive servant characteristics. God wants us to be a servant as well. Matthew 20, verses 20 to 28, one of my many favorite stories there about being a servant, and it's about when the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to her and came to Jesus and said, "Hey, allow my sons to sit on one side and the other sit on the other." This particular mother wanted their sons, and that's a motherly thought, I guess, is to want the best for your children, etc. But she wanted them to be the greatest. Jesus basically says, hey, to be the greatest, you're going to have to be a servant. You're going to have to be a servant. Any ideas of grandeur of being a servant in God's kingdom won't work. We have to desire to be that servant. But that means we're going to have to regard in our mind that other people are more important than us. Because that's how God wants it. He says it in Philippians 2 through Paul. Philippians 2 verses 7. Basically, he says, regard yourself less than others. Regard others more than yourself. And that's hard to do, you see. But the characteristics of a servant that Jesus wants does that. And we've got to do that too. If we want to be a servant, and we should want to be a servant. Because that servanthood leads to being one of God's heroes. And I want that for you. I want that for me. I want to be one of God's heroes. And I want you to be one of God's heroes. Caleb was a servant. It also says he was a person with a different spirit. That's basically a different attitude. Now, we all know the importance of our attitudes. Our altitude, you've heard of our altitude is determined by our attitude. Our attitude. The positive attitude that we've got to have. Caleb had a can-do attitude. He had a bold attitude. He had an attitude that had courage. And it was different than the others because their attitude wanted to hold God's people back. Their attitude said, no, we can't do this. Caleb says, we can do this. And he stood up, all right? This different attitude caused him to stand up in the face of adversity. He stood up and said, hey, what are you talking about? And he chastised them so much that the other 10 wanted to stone Caleb. But he held his ground. And God interceded there at that moment when that happened. See, that's a person with a different attitude. And Paul says in Romans 12:2, he says, do not be conformed to this world. See, that's what happens so much. See, we don't want to be different a lot of times. We want to mingle and mix with the crowd. We want to kind of conform with everybody so we don't stick out like a sore thumb. See, Caleb didn't do that. Caleb stood up for what he believed in. And it didn't matter who stood up against him. Many times, see, we shudder at a thought like that. It takes courage to be different. And that's who we're supposed to be, a peculiar, different people than the rest of the world. We must speak the truth despite the adversities that might linger there. We have to have that different spirit, different attitude. Look at the attitude of Daniel. Yeah, I'm going to follow God no matter what the king says. And Joseph following God despite all of the hardships and handicaps that he had. The length of time he stayed in the dungeon. He followed God no matter what. What about John the Baptizer? It led to him being beheaded because of what he believed and the different spirit that he had that caused him to be bold enough to speak the truth. A hero is a servant. A hero is a person with a can-do attitude, a different attitude than the world. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Do we believe that? Do we believe that? Do the thing that you fear the most, and the death of fear is certain. Ralph Waldo Emerson. See, we've got to step out on the limb for God. Norman, who's your hero? Mickey Mantle? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Caleb surrendered to God wholly, fully. And that holy is W-H, not H-O-L-Y. W-H, that means he did everything that God asked him to do. He didn't leave out anything. We're told that the other Israelites did not follow God wholly, but Caleb followed God wholly. He obeyed. He was loyal. He believed. He never wavered, whether he was 40 years old or 80 or 85 years old. Caleb followed God wholly, everything that God told him to do. The world nowadays, characteristics, they may follow God partly. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. Every. Holy. And that's what we have to do to be a hero for God. I want you to be a hero for God. I want to be a hero for God. I want to be a servant. I want to be a person with a different attitude. I want to be a person who wholly follows God. And that's what I want for you. So when somebody asks me, Norman, who's your hero? I won't be ashamed and say, Mickey Mantle, you know. I won't say Nick. I won't say Jake, Jonathan, Rick, Jazz, Tommy. I want all of us to be listed in the God's hero, as God's hero, and God's Hall of Fame. Every brother and sister here, I want us listed there. I want this spiritual congregation and family to be my hero. Because it's going to take you, it's going to take me, all of us working together to help keep us on the right track. And God wants us there. God does not wish that any should perish, but all should come to everlasting life. He wants every one of us and every one of those who did not fully follow God and who don't fully follow God today. He wants them to obey him as well. 2 Peter 3:9. Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. And one of the points, a lot of people, baptism, don't have to be baptized. You see, that's the difference in a person not following God wholly and following God wholly. And after your baptism, remaining that loyal, honest, truthful servant to be called, he wholly followed God, or she wholly followed God. Jesus asked, why do you call me Lord and do not do the things I tell you to do? That's a good question. That's a good question. Why do you say you love God but don't follow him? It's a good question. In conclusion, Joshua over in 14:12 went to Moses and said, give me the mountain that I was promised. And Moses said, you got it, brother. You got it. God has told us he's going to give us something too. John 14. Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again. And just like Caleb expected God to honor his promise, we have the expectations as well. And God will not let us down. Will not let us down. Let's become heroes for God. Let's become that servant. Let's become that person with a different attitude. Let's become that person who wholly follows God by obedience and by surrendering our life to him. For any reason we can help you this morning, let it be made known now while we stand and sing.